Last Tuesday, I found myself sitting across from a man at a quiet, glass-walled bistro in Palo Alto, the kind of place where the filtered water costs more than the espresso. He called himself a policy architect, and for the first 20 minutes, he spoke with the somber, hushed intensity of a man trying to save the world from itself. He used phrases like existential guardrails and digital theocracy with practiced gravity. To him, the rapid expansion of AI wasn't a feat of engineering. It was a looming catastrophe that required a massive institutional filter to keep humanity in control. He even pulled up a document on his tablet, a draft of a proposed safety framework he'd been consulting on. It was just a dense bureaucratic labyrinth of mandatory audits, environmental impact cooling-off periods, and multi-year alignment reviews. He looked at the scrolling text like a priest looks at scripture. "We have to build the moats now," he whispered, "or we lose our seat at the table of history." But then his phone buzzed with a news alert about California's Accelerated Innovation Act passing. I watched his face carefully. The somber humanitarian mask didn't just slip, it completely evaporated. He didn't look worried about a potential AI apocalypse. He looked like a landlord who had just been told his building was being demolished for a high-speed rail. He started pacing the small cafe, calling the act regime change, and complaining that his entire regulatory framework had been surgically struck into irrelevance. The shift was instantaneous. One minute he was the moral guardian of the future, the next he was just a gatekeeper who had lost his gate. It made me realize that the heated debate over AI safety often has very little to do with protecting the world and everything to do with protecting the power of the people who get to say no. California just took the brakes off, and the people who made a living holding the lever are terrified of how fast we're about to move. That story, which I swear is completely true, perfectly captures the core tension we are diving into today. This clash between institutional safetyism, that reflexive urge to slow things down and build bureaucratic moats, and the relentless push for unrestricted technological expansion. It's a defining conflict for our time, one that plays out on the philosophical, the political, and critically, the physical levels of our infrastructure.
It's a profound shift, and when we examine the source material for this deep dive, that conflict really crystallized into three lenses that help us understand the future of compute and artificial intelligence. The first lens is, well, it's the political fight over who gets to innovate. This means understanding the strategic implications of innovation acts, like the one that shocked your policy architect, and their ability to dismantle what's called regulatory capture and prevent established AI giants from using safety washing as a pretext to monopolize the global compute supply chain. That policy architect you mentioned, he feared a digital theocracy, which is really just a new term for an old idea. Regulatory capture, where a small number of technologically advanced companies write the rules for everyone else.
So who controls the lever of policy? That's the first lens.
Exactly. The second lens is intensely physical. How the massive, unprecedented demand for processing power is creating a thermodynamic necessity for unrestricted technological expansion, maybe toward a potential post-scarcity society. This requires examining the integration of modular nuclear reactors and high-density data center architecture as the physical foundation for sovereign compute stacks. We were talking about the literal power requirements.
Right, the atoms behind the bits.
Precisely. And the third lens brings us back to the ideological roots, deconstructing the conflict between that institutional safetyism we just talked about and what's been called the Promethean Drive for Artificial General Intelligence, or AGI. The recent legislative victories signal a potential end to the Great Stagnation and maybe the inevitable transition toward a radically accelerated future.
Okay, let's unpack this ideological core first. For a long time, the global tension around AI ethics has been framed as a binary choice. You have the European approach, often characterized by favoring caution and regulation, prioritizing the fundamental rights of the citizen over technological speeds.
Right, safety first.
And then the American approach, which privileges innovation, even if it comes at the cost of accepting heightened risk. You had to choose safety or speed.
And that's what this framework of acceleration AI ethics attempts to obliterate. It defines itself as a third way, arguing that true safety is maximized through innovation, not by sacrificing it. The central idea requires a radical shift in perspective. Instead of slowing research and development to mitigate risks, the goal is to massively accelerate innovation to surge ahead and resolve the risks that technology creates. Risk isn't a wall, it's a launch pad.
So the risk isn't seen as a regulatory failure, but as a technical challenge that hasn't been solved yet.
Precisely. This leads directly to the first core element of this philosophy. Innovation solves innovation problems. If a new technology creates a problem, you don't stop the research, you build a better tool to fix it. Think about the issue of privacy vulnerabilities in large datasets used for training. A cautious approach, what we could call technological constriction, would involve restricting access to information, circumscribing the tool with regulatory gateways, or limiting the types of data that can be used.
But the accelerationist logic flips that entirely.
It demands that the same innovative potential that initially created the privacy vulnerabilities surges ahead to address them. For example, instead of constricting the dataset by limiting its size, you build innovative new techniques, like injecting noise into the dataset to obscure personal information while still maintaining data utility for training the AI.
Oh, interesting. So you don't remove the data, you just make the sensitive parts illegible.
You make them useless to a bad actor, yeah. Or you use highly creative algorithmic methods like machine unlearning, which essentially allows specific data points to be erased from the model's memory, giving users more effective control. The constant, relentless answer is always more innovation, moving faster to outpace the problem.
That makes profound sense from an engineering perspective. The fastest path to the solution is often through the problem. But philosophically, this is where it gets really interesting, because we're talking about innovation as intrinsically valuable. This is a revolutionary claim that technical progress holds value entirely independently of its downstream effects or subsequent practical uses.
This stance is absolutely critical because it separates the act of discovery from the consequences of deployment. The claim is that a new AI model is valuable simply for the creative, difficult act of its construction, regardless of how it is later exploited by criminals, used for surveillance, or even if it causes unforeseen job losses.
And this is where the analogy to art comes in, right?
Yes. We don't judge a masterpiece, a creative act, a moment of profound human effort, by how a violent criminal later uses the opaque art market to launder money or evade taxes. The art is separate from the money laundering. In the same way, the creative act of technical discovery is seen as separate from its subsequent employment.
But what about ethical recklessness? That sounds like a license to ignore consequences. I mean, what do critics of accelerationism say about solving a problem after it causes harm?
That is the primary critique, absolutely. They argue that this view, which is very different from, say, older neo-Kantian views where value is judged only by external downstream benefits, allows engineers to abdicate social responsibility. But for the accelerationists, the burden shifts. Under this new model, engineers resemble artists. They no longer need to justify why they are creating in the first place or what specific social benefit their creation will serve. Instead, the burden shifts. Others are responsible for explaining why they should stop. The creator must only justify the quality of the technical solution, not the need for the solution.
And if we don't know where this unleashed potential is going, that's not a reason to stop. It's actually a reason to speed up. Which brings us to the third element. The unknown is encouraging. Uncertainty isn't viewed as a risk to be minimized, but as a vast untapped potential.
This is the essence of the Promethean Drive. If an advance's effects are unclear, radical, or potentially disruptive, that is interpreted as an inspiration, not a warning. It suggests that AI models can and should be developed without strict, predetermined purposes. The source material describes it as traveling like a nomad. You move just to see what emerges from the landscape, rather than following a map to a known destination. The sheer act of not knowing is magnetic.
The analogy of Isabel Eberhardt really captures that freedom.
It does. She was the 19th century Swiss explorer who rejected her life in Europe and moved to North Africa, essentially going native and living a nomadic existence in the Sahara. She departed precisely because she had no way to foresee how she would change or what specific destination she would reach. The joy of her journey, which was filled with both incredible liberation and profound danger, was rooted in the sheer uncertainty of the undertaking. Acceleration ethics adopts this value. Technical innovation is valuable not despite the unknowns, but precisely because there is no knowing where it will lead and what changes it would catalyze. The unknown guarantees novelty.
So if the creator is free to follow the unknown and build things with intrinsic value, the question then becomes, how do we manage this unleashed potential once it enters society? That brings us to how this philosophy handles governance, which must be decentralized governance.
In this framework, permissions and restrictions derive from the broad community of users after a tool has been employed, and from inside its use, not preemptively imposed by a select group of overseers. This operates on two essential vectors. First, guidelines come after a tool has been deployed, not as a condition for deployment. And second, governance emerges from the community inside the technology, rather than being imposed from outside by a regulatory body.
That model directly challenges the structure that my policy architect friend was trying to build, that central hierarchical institutional filter.
It's the antithesis of it. The best practical illustration of this decentralized model is the oversight system for X, formerly known as Twitter, provided by Community Notes. When a post contains misinformation, contributors propose notes containing corrections, and other contributors then vote on the helpfulness and accuracy of that note.
And the key is that it has to find consensus across opposing viewpoints, right?
Yeah.
It can't just be one side downvoting the other.
Exactly. The algorithmic arrangement ensures that notes are only legitimated if they are found helpful and factual across a broad range of users with diverse orientations and unaligned interests. This reduces factual bias and ensures that the judgment, what counts as misinformation, circulates through the platform's operation, determined after the content emerges and by the platform's community.
So the governance system isn't a small, unelected board sitting above the platform passing judgment, which is the institutional model. It is the collective, constantly shifting intelligence of the users working within the platform's operation, reflecting real-world use and feedback.
Correct. And finally, the fifth element, embedded ethics. This flips the traditional compliance script where ethics is viewed as a restrictive hurdle you have to clear before launching a product.
Instead of a stop sign, it becomes a speed bump that recharges the engine.
Embedding ethics transforms it into an innovation catalyst. Instead of posing a pass or fail ethics test that determines whether a technology is allowed to go forward, ethics becomes about finding ways to push technology forward by solving ethical problems. Think about medical AI, which needs to transcribe highly personal health histories into electronic data. This raises major privacy and security questions. The old approach would halt the project or require massive data restrictions.
The accelerationist approach says, solve the privacy problem through better tech.
You integrate the ethicists and the engineers not to restrict, but to innovate. The ethical constraint becomes the source of a new engineering challenge. The real-world soundbite that captures this perfectly is challenging developers to come up with solutions and to enhance the guardrails to create the outcomes that we're looking for. The ethical guardrail becomes a way of doing innovation, not preventing it.
That philosophical framework is powerful, but we need to see it in motion. Let's look at how the Canadian telecommunications company TELUS applied this accelerationist approach when building their GenieAI conversational agent, and how they turned a massive privacy risk into a market differentiator.
TELUS publicly introduced this conversational agent in May 2024. The use case was perfect for this kind of innovation. Streamline customer support across their incredibly wide menu of services, which spans billing, internet connectivity, mobile communications, and even their substantial healthcare division. They needed a tool that could handle immense complexity at speed.
And what were the immediate tangible results of this decision to accelerate rather than wait for, maturity?
The early metrics demonstrated clear success, validating the approach. In the first months of deployment, the AI tool answered over 50,000 customer calls. More importantly, it provided complete, accurate information for 28% of all callers who would otherwise have needed to wait for a human agent or attempt a frustrating conventional site search. This created immediate time efficiency for the customer and significantly reduced the human agent workload, freeing human operators to focus exclusively on complex, atypical, or high-value service requests that required human nuance.
And the core technology they used wasn't just an off-the-shelf foundation model. They built their own innovation engine to drive this system.
Yes. They developed an in-house innovation called Fuel 9X. This is essentially a sophisticated system that interfaces the company's internal documentation and data. We're talking hundreds of millions of documents with the major underlying large language models. The clever part is that Fuel 9X is designed as a plug-and-play technology. This frees TELUS to update their customer agent independently of any specific foundational model vendor as language technology advances. They aren't locked into a single gatekeeper's model. They can accelerate by swapping components.
That decision to build their own interoperable system and jump in immediately directly reflects the innovation is intrinsically valuable principle. They took the risk of integrating this technology before all possible privacy issues were mapped out.
Exactly. The Chief Analytics and Insights Officer publicly confirmed that the company faced precisely this dilemma. Whether to wait for privacy maturity, meaning confirming the mitigation of all threats before advancing, or whether to jump in and try to experiment. They chose the latter, affirming the accelerative approach. They insisted on responsible AI, defining their language model as safe and secure, underlining that more innovation is the route to data security, not constraint.
But dealing with a telecommunications company means dealing with incredibly sensitive data, mobile location, medical data, surfing history. That risk exposure is massive, especially extraction via prompt hacking. How did they apply the innovation solves innovation problems principle to handle that?
Well, their solution was not a restrictive legal hurdle or a data limitation, but the development of another layer of AI. They built a secondary language agent designed specifically to identify privacy risk areas within customer interactions. This agent's job was to act as an automated privacy filter, flagging those specific areas of interaction so they could be immediately marked and efficiently forwarded to human reviewers for oversight and compliance.
So AI created the privacy challenge, and AI provided the mechanism for triage, management, and review. That demonstrates how embedded ethics works in practice. The ethical constraint became a new engineering problem for which they found an innovative solution.
And they applied the decentralized feedback loop of adversarial attacks to sharpen their defenses. The internal team sought to refine their automated safety system by constantly retraining and updating the tool with strategies gleaned from the internet's darker corners. They called it automated red teaming. This involved simulated adversarial attacks, sharpened by the most effective prompt injection and extraction strategies found online. It demonstrates embedded ethics in action, using constant real-world functioning and decentralized, aggressive feedback to evolve the safety system, instead of relying on slow, preemptive judgment from external auditors.
And the outcome wasn't just internal confidence in their technology, it was external validation.
Correct. The TELUS language model became the first generative AI solution to achieve certification for privacy by design, meeting the rigorous requirements of ISO 3110001. The significant point is the mindset. They treated ethics not as a restrictive prerequisite that needed to be fulfilled before innovating, but as a challenge for engineering innovation. That mindset is what allowed them to simultaneously jump in and do it in a responsible way without waiting for maturity and falling prey to institutional stagnation.
So we have the philosophy of acceleration and a real-world case study. Now, let's pivot to the resistance, the gatekeepers, and the battle being waged in policy rooms across the country. Regulatory capture is where private interests are unjustly prioritized over public welfare, potentially resulting in policy that is ineffective, unsafe, or unjust. It's the mechanism that protects the incumbent giants.
When policy experts analyze this, they identify numerous recurring mechanisms through which industry influence can lead to this capture, creating structures designed to lock in advantages for the few. These mechanisms are often subtle, designed to steer the conversation away from core competition issues.
Let's start with how the industry structures the debate itself, agenda setting.
This is the most frequently cited mechanism by experts we've studied. 15 out of 17 experts interviewed expressed concern that industry actors actively steer policy conversations. They advance anti-regulation narratives when it affects their core business, and crucially, they set default standards or metrics that fail to reflect broader public interest goals. They want the public to worry about their issues, not the public's issues.
And they prefer to keep those fights in the shadows, right? But
Yeah.
they have an informational advantage.
Exactly. Companies prefer to have fights in the technical weeds, where they hold informational superiority over government actors who often lack the highly specialized technical staff. The goal is to make any opposition feel like they are constantly losing the argument because they lack the necessary internal data or technical nuance to challenge the company's claims effectively.
Which brings us to a specific strategy: misdirection through metrics, diverting attention to easier, often visual, issues.
That's where the concept of the holy grail of AI ethics comes in. Companies often frame demographic diversity in generated content, making sure AI images reflect diverse populations as the single most important goal of AI ethics. While diversity matters, this framing distracts from the broader, more critical concerns about AI's actual systemic effects on labor markets, economic inequality, and democratic governance. It's a focus on the visible, less consequential problem to mask the harder, systemic ones.
Then there's the familiar mechanism of the revolving door. It guarantees that institutional knowledge flows directly into the industry's lobbying efforts.
This movement is pervasive. We see former congressional technology policy staffers transitioning directly into lucrative lobbying or consulting roles at the very AI companies they were supposed to be regulating. This dynamic is self-reinforcing. The individual who writes the first draft of AI rules or sets up the first enforcement systems becomes highly sought after by the industry, which then uses that person's expertise and context to influence the implementation and future direction of those very regulations.
And what about undermining external critique? Status or expertise anchoring, making sure only the builders are listened to.
That mechanism leverages intellectual status, technical expertise, and social status to control the narrative. Industry players actively work to disparage non-industry experts, often labeling them as old, outdated, or fearful. Simultaneously, they promote the builders, those who claim to truly understand the technology and argue that the risks should not be feared because they, the technical engineers, are uniquely equipped to manage them. This anchors expertise firmly within the industry, diminishing outside voices and maintaining that digital theocracy.
Finally, the aggressive approach, procedural evasion, what you might call the Uber model.
This is where companies intentionally disrupt existing structures first, normalizing a lack of enforcement. They proceed with disruption until historic rules meant to protect consumers, labor, or market stability can no longer be effectively extended to the new technology because the new systems have already been built in ways that bypass the old protections. They normalize the lack of enforcement until the rules change around them.
All these mechanisms lead to regulatory structures that solidify the position of established actors. This brings us to the specific California proposal, SB 2047, which critics argue is the perfect example of a gatekeeper's moat, disguised as necessary safety legislation.
We have to be clear. The advocates of SB 2047 argue that this bill is absolutely necessary to prevent genuinely catastrophic outcomes from the misuse of the most powerful foundational models. The stated goal is preventing large-scale harm. However, the critique is about whether the mechanism achieves that goal without creating immense regulatory capture and stifling the competition that accelerationists believe is essential for safety.
So what's the core mechanism that critics say leads to capture?
The primary criticism is that the law makes the fundamental mistake of regulating AI technology. Specifically, models costing over $100 million to train instead of regulating harmful applications. This distinction is crucial because it immediately targets the developers creating the foundational technology, regardless of whether that technology is used for good or ill. If you regulate the tool, you hit the source. If you regulate the use, you only target the bad actors.
And that leads to this huge gray zone of personal and legal risk for developers.
The law introduces complex, ambiguous reporting requirements and significant penalties. Developers would have to submit a certification under penalty of perjury, analyzing the nature and magnitude of critical harms the model might reasonably cause. This is a massive personal risk because even the world's leading AI researchers fundamentally disagree on what constitutes a critical harm and what the likelihood of these future harms actually is.
Wait, how can a developer, under penalty of perjury, swear that they've accounted for unknown future harms that the entire research community is debating? That sounds as a technical impossibility.
It creates an impossible standard designed to create liability. The law also requires developers to implement protections to prevent misuse of or unsafe post-training modifications, appropriate in light of risks from advanced persistent threats or other sophisticated actors. Again, there is zero consensus on what is appropriate in this context. This forces teams to hire expensive lawyers, compliance consultants, and auditors, not to improve safety, but just to navigate the ambiguity and potentially avoid jail time or significant fines.
The vagueness itself becomes a massive compliance cost that only the largest actors can bear. This seems particularly devastating for the open source community, which is a key driver of acceleration.
The ambiguity creates compliance costs that are impossible for non-revenue generating entities to shoulder. Open source contributors who lack the funds to pay lobbyists or legal experts would be locked out of developing competitive models above the computation threshold. This acts as an insurmountable entry barrier, effectively protecting the massive vested interests, the gatekeepers, that can afford full legal and lobbying teams to manage the risk of the perjury clause. By raising the cost of development and compliance, the law stifles openness, which is often described as a key pillar of safe, decentralized AI innovation.
And if the law passes, it creates an institutional structure that is ripe for ongoing capture, the Frontier Model Division.
That's the concern regarding the Frontier Model Division, or FMD. This bill would create an unelected 5-person board with the power to dictate standards and, crucially, arbitrarily change the computation threshold subject to oversight. This structure is inherently susceptible to lobbying by those established, well-funded interests whose goal is to stifle openness and maintain control over who gets to innovate at the frontier. The gatekeepers would be given a permanent gate to stand in front of.
So the battle between acceleration and gatekeeping isn't just philosophical or legislative. It hits the physical world too. All this accelerating computation requires an unprecedented amount of energy, and that requirement is driving massive infrastructure changes. Okay, let's unpack the actual scale of the compute demand surge. How big is this going to be?
The energy demands are staggering, and they are happening now. The U.S. is facing a rapid and short-term increase in data center, or DC, energy demand. Projections indicate a total increase of 24 to 74 gigawatt years electrical, we'll call that GWE, by 2028. To put that into perspective, meeting that surge solely with nuclear energy would require installing 27 to 85 gigawatts electrical, or GWE, of new generating capacity. That is the capacity of dozens of new full-size nuclear power plants, and we need it almost immediately.
Why are data centers suddenly so much more power hungry than they were a few years ago when they were mostly just storage?
It's the AI load profile. AI training, high-performance computing, and crypto mining facilities have a disproportionate influence on electricity demand. They aren't just storing data, they are actively churning massive computational cycles. Specifically, AI training centers rely heavily on thousands of high-density GPUs, which leads to extremely high power densities, over 30 kilowatts per rack, and they sustain very high utilization rates. They are running near capacity almost constantly. For a concrete example, training a single early large-scale language model required an estimated 10 terawatt hours of electricity. That is equivalent to the annual energy output of a major city.
This means we can't power this AI future with intermittent energy sources or by just upgrading the existing grid slightly. It requires a massive, stable, 247 high-density power source, nuclear. And we are already seeing major tech companies making unprecedented commitments.
Absolutely. The colocation trend, putting the data center right next to the power source, is happening now because the existing grid cannot handle this demand reliably. We see massive corporate commitments like Amazon Web Services signing agreements to secure 1.9 GeV of power from the Susquehanna Steam Electric Station. AWS is also partnering with advanced small modular reactor developers like X Energy for the X100 reactor technology, aiming for approximately 1 GeV by 2040.
What's the difference between an SMR like the X100 and a traditional large reactor?
Traditional reactors are typically 1,000 milliliters or more, built on-site, and require decades of planning. The X100 and other SMRs are smaller, around 80 milliliters to 400 milliliters, and are designed to be factory fabricated and transported to the site. The X100 is specifically a high-temperature gas-cooled reactor that uses ceramic fuel particles, making it inherently safer and more adaptable to industrial use. Google has similar corporate agreements with Kairos Power for their KP-FHR technology, targeting about 500 milliliters by 2035. Even Meta has released a request for proposals seeking developers to build 1 to 4 GeV of new nuclear generation capacity in the U.S.
The market has chosen the power source. But here's where the bottleneck emerges: the fuel. These advanced SMRs don't run on standard low-enriched uranium. They require HELU.
This is the critical constraint. The acceleration of compute is fundamentally constrained by the acceleration of specialized fuel production. HAU, or high-assay low-enriched uranium, is enriched greater than 5%, but less than 19.75% U-235. It is necessary for these smaller, more efficient reactors. To meet just the announced deployment targets from Google and AWS by 2040, which is only a fraction of the total projected demand, HALU production must ramp up to approximately 6 tons per year.
6 tons doesn't sound like much, but why is this so difficult right now?
The challenge is stark because currently there is effectively no domestic commercial large-scale supplier for HALU. Standard nuclear power uses LEU, or low-enriched uranium, which is less than 5%. HALU requires specialized manufacturing and enrichment infrastructure that has been dormant or non-existent in the U.S. for decades. The Department of Energy is currently providing limited amounts from down-blending highly enriched uranium stockpiles just to support immediate demonstration needs, but the commercial supply chain is nascent. In other words, we have the jet, but we haven't finished mining and processing the specialized fuel yet. This is the ultimate first-world, high-tech bottleneck of the compute age.
Let's discuss the architecture of these nuclear-powered data centers. Reliability is everything, which is why they are looking at specific coupling options defined by the rigorous Tier 4 standard for fault-tolerant power topology.
We analyzed 5 main coupling options. Tier 4 demands that the system can sustain at least 99.995% uptime, meaning the power must be fault-tolerant. The coupling options determine how the nuclear power plant and data center connect to each other and the bulk power system, or the main electrical grid.
Let's focus on the distinction between the grid-connected models and the isolated models.
In the colocation grid-connected model, the NPP and DC are physically close enough to share a substation and its interconnection to the high-voltage grid. The NPP exports full power to the grid but provides a highly reliable direct connection to the DC. This saves on costly transmission infrastructure and offers reliable grid backup if the nuclear plant needs to shut down. This minimizes the chance of losing that critical 99.995% uptime.
And the islanded microgrid model, which is the ultimate goal for many high-density compute facilities.
That's option 4. Here, the entire DC and MPP setup is completely isolated from the BPS. Its high reliability depends entirely on the nuclear power plant and its immediate redundant backup systems. The DC relies on the MPP as its single source of truth for power, which requires immense confidence in the reactor design and architecture.
The choice of coupling option actually dictates the optimal size of the reactor you should build. This is where the economics of scale gets surprisingly complicated.
It does. The ideal reactor size is not universal. For high-demand DCs and grid-connected systems, building one large reactor matching the demand up to about 1,000 milliway minimizes the levelized cost of electricity, or LCOE. LCOE is simply the lowest possible price of the power needed to make the project economically viable. Economies of scale overwhelmingly favor the larger unit when grid backup is guaranteed.
But the dynamic changes entirely when you go off-grid, aiming for that true isolation and high reliability, like in the islanded microgrid.
For those isolated systems, achieving the necessary fault-tolerant reliability means you must build multiple smaller reactors. If a data center has a massive demand, say 6,000 milliwee, the optimal solution is not 6 large reactors, but rather 16 units of 400 milliwee reactors. If you rely on multiple smaller SMR units and one goes down for refueling or maintenance, the rest can maintain high reliability for the critical load. This finding heavily incentivizes the use of SMRs for islanded, ultra-high reliability DC deployments, driving the market towards smaller, advanced reactor technology.
This brings us to where these gargantuan power complexes can actually be built. We've established the acceleration push, the need for nuclear, and the fuel constraint. But where does the land and, crucially, the water come from?
Siting analysis reveals a massive constraint, primarily water availability. AI and HPC facilities often require liquid cooling, making them inherently water-intensive. Cooling alone accounts for roughly 30% to 50% of a data center's total energy consumption. West of the Mississippi River, water scarcity becomes the primary barrier for both new nuclear plants and data centers.
So we need to locate where water and suitability overlap, and the Midwest comes up high on the suitability list.
The analysis shows that city water-cooled SMR and DC combinations offer the broadest suitability, leveraging existing municipal water infrastructure. We see high suitability scores in states like Indiana, Illinois, and Iowa. Conversely, the high water consumption of large light water reactors already limits suitability around many river systems, regardless of the DC's cooling type. The combination with the least constraints for greenfield development relies on existing municipal water infrastructure.
Instead of tearing up new land, there's a massive opportunity in repurposing existing industrial infrastructure, the brownfield opportunity.
Reusing existing power plant sites is highly viable because they already have the necessary power infrastructure, substation connectivity, and water access. We found that 87% of the 54 operational U.S. nuclear power plant sites are suitable for hosting hyperscale data centers facilities around 200 acres. This is a massive opportunity to maximize land use and existing grid infrastructure.
And it's not just current nuclear sites. Former coal-fired power plants, or CPP sites, are also prime candidates, which offers an economic lifeline to communities facing energy transition.
Yes, retiring CPP sites are excellent brownfield candidates because they already have the necessary power and water connectivity. The top states for colocation of a hyperscale DC and a new NPP at a former CPP site are Wyoming, Indiana, and Kentucky. If you are a listener in those states, the AI compute revolution is about to fundamentally change your local economy and job market by repurposing industrial history into the physical foundation of the future.
Speaking of economics, let's look at the job creation and output impact of these colocation projects, especially comparing the relative economic value of the power source versus the compute source.
The socioeconomic impacts are eye-opening. For instance, a hypothetical 1 gigawatt DC requires around 1,000 operational employees. In an urban setting, this facility creates or sustains approximately 6,300 total jobs, including vast supply chain and community jobs.
That's a huge multiplier. The data center is creating over 6 additional jobs for every 1 operational job.
The data center's employment multiplier is 6.3, meaning 5.3 additional jobs are created for every operational DC job. This is notably higher than the multipliers for nuclear reactors. A large reactor shows 4.0, and an SMR shows 5.6. The majority of jobs created by the DC come from its large supply chain requirements, all the technical services, software, security, and hardware that feed it.
And when you look at the total output, the revenue equivalent, The data center significantly outpaces the power plant, even though the power plant makes the entire operation possible.
That's the critical takeaway and the so what moment for the future economy. The annual output impact equivalent to revenue for a 1 GWDC in an urban setting is projected at $2.4 billion. This far exceeds the projected $1.2 billion output for a large nuclear reactor, even a similarly sized one. The information processing generated twice the revenue equivalent of the power plant that fuels it. That tells you everything about the economic value of the compute revolution. The data processing is fundamentally the higher value activity.
How does location affect these huge numbers? If this gets built on a former coal site in rural Wyoming, does the local economy get the full $2.4 billion impact?
Moving these facilities to rural areas significantly reduces the economic impact, primarily due to the decreased capacity of local supply chains. For both nuclear reactors and data centers, the total output impact is reduced by about 30% if they are located in a rural area compared to an urban one. For labor income, moving a DC to a rural area reduces the value-added impact by 42%. However, even with that reduction, the total output impact of a DC or nuclear reactor remains a significant, transformative portion of the overall economic activity for that area. It creates a major opportunity for high-paying technical jobs in communities that desperately need economic transition.
We've traveled from the philosophical high ground of acceleration ethics and the belief in innovation's intrinsic value through the political battlegrounds of regulatory capture and the fight over open source in Sacramento, and landed squarely on the staggering physical requirements of a compute-powered future. The policy battles are fast, but the infrastructure changes required are generational and global. The future, whether open and accelerated or managed by gatekeepers, will be defined by compute and powered by the atom.
The sheer thermodynamic scale of the compute demand, the projection that the U.S. will need between 27 and 85 GWh of new installed nuclear capacity in the short term, coupled with the immediate national challenge of establishing a commercial HLEU fuel supply chain, shows that the debate over AI policy is inextricably linked to infrastructure policy. The end of stagnation, which the accelerationists desire, is measured not just in lines of code or pages of regulation, but in tons of specialized fuel and megawatts of power. The acceleration of AI absolutely requires the acceleration of atoms.